Los Angeles, 1967. A city balanced between the fading shimmer of old Hollywood and the rising heat of cultural rebellion. In a windowless training hall tucked behind a dry cleaner on Southwestern Avenue. The air hung thick with the smell of canvas, leather, and decades of accumulated sweat. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, casting harsh white light across scuffed wooden floors marked with tape outlines of sparring zones. This was the place where reputations were tested away from cameras, where ego met reality in spaces small enough that lies couldn't hide. In 4 minutes, something would happen in that room that only 4 people would witness. Something that would change the trajectory of martial arts in America. Something that would never be discussed publicly by those who saw it, creating a silence more powerful than any advertisement. But to understand those 4 minutes, you have to understand the two men who stood at opposite ends of that training hall and the invisible wall of assumption that separated them. Bruce Lee was 26 years old, 5 feet 7 inches, 135 pounds of coiled precision. He moved through the space with the fluid economy of someone who had eliminated every unnecessary motion from his repertoire, whose body had become a conversation between philosophy and physics. His black hair was cut short, practical. He wore a simple gray t-shirt that clung to a frame built not for show but for devastating efficiency, and loose black training pants that allowed his legs complete freedom of motion. His feet were bare, toes spread wide against the wood, sensing texture and angle with the awareness most people reserved for their fingertips. He had been in America for 6 years. 6 years of teaching, adapting, evolving. 6 years of watching students who thought they understood combat because they'd memorized kata, collected belts, won trophies in matches with rules designed to prevent actual damage. He'd spent those years dismantling his own certainties, questioning everything his Wing Chun masters in Hong Kong had taught him, rebuilding martial arts from first principles. What actually worked when someone wanted to hurt you? What could you discard when survival was the only metric that mattered? His students called him Sifu Teacher, but Bruce Lee had never been interested in collecting followers. He wanted to create fighters who could think, adapt, overcome, people who understood that fighting was problem-solving at a violent speed. That technique without understanding was just choreography with bruises. Across the room, Joe Louis represented everything Bruce Lee was trying to transcend. 6 feet tall, 190 pounds of championship-hardened muscle, 23 years old with a face that photography loved, strong jaw, clear eyes, the kind of all-American handsomeness that made him a natural for magazine covers. He'd won the United States Karate Championship earlier that year, demolishing opponents with the kind of systematic brutality that made highlight reels. His kicks landed like automobile accidents. His punches arrived with the authority of someone who'd never questioned whether violence would solve the problem at hand. He wore a pristine white GI, the fabric still crisp from recent laundering, the black belt knotted with the precise symmetry of military discipline. His Marine Corps training showed in his posture, spine straight, shoulders squared, weight distributed with the readiness of someone prepared to respond to threats from any direction. He'd served in Okinawa, trained with masters whose lineages stretched back centuries, earned rank through traditional testing that left blood on the dojo floor. Joe Louis had heard about Bruce Lee. Everyone in the martial arts community had heard about Bruce Lee. The Chinese guy teaching that Jung Fan Gong Fu, or whatever he called it, the guy who thought traditional forms were useless, who dismissed kata as organized despair, who claimed that most martial artists were studying classical patterns that would get them killed in actual confrontation. The guy who, despite having no tournament record, no official ranking in any established system, had somehow attracted a following of serious practitioners willing to question everything they'd been taught. It irritated Joe Louis in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He'd earned his rank the legitimate way: years of discipline, formal testing, competition victories that put his name in magazines. He'd proven himself in matches with rules, yes, but matches that separated winners from losers with objective clarity. Bruce Lee had proven himself in, what? Demonstrations, backroom challenges, stories that couldn't be verified. The meeting had been arranged by Bob Baker, one of Joe's training partners who'd started taking private lessons with Bruce. Bob insisted that Joe needed to experience Bruce's approach firsthand, that watching wouldn't be enough. Joe had agreed, mostly to settle his curiosity. He'd train with the guy for an afternoon, see what the fuss was about, probably learn a few interesting techniques he could incorporate into his competition strategy. He hadn't expected to be challenged. The other 2 people in the room stood near the wall. Bob Baker, who'd made the introduction and now watched with the nervous energy of someone who'd set events in motion he couldn't control, and Dan Inosanto, Bruce's assistant instructor, a Filipino-American fighter whose own journey through multiple martial arts systems had taught him that mastery often meant unlearning. Bruce approached the center of the room. His footsteps made no sound. He moved without the preparatory tension that telegraphed intention, arriving at the tape-marked sparring zone as if he'd materialized, rather than walked. Joe stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd stood in this position hundreds of times, facing opponents who all ultimately fell into predictable patterns. He assumed the front stance. He drilled 10,000 times, left foot forward, weight 60% on the back leg, hands raised in the chamber, positions that allowed for rapid strikes while maintaining defensive structure. Bruce stood with his right foot forward, left foot back, knees slightly bent, weight distributed in a way that looked almost casual. His hands were up but loose, not clenched into a tightness that signaled commitment to a specific technique. He looked relaxed in a way that Joe found vaguely insulting. This was supposed to be a serious training session. "What do you want to work on?" Joe asked, assuming this would be technical exchange, a sharing of knowledge between practitioners. Bruce's expression didn't change. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of the deference Joe had unconsciously expected. It was quiet but perfectly clear, the tone of someone stating observable fact rather than offering opinion. "I want to hit you." Joe felt something shift in his chest, not quite anger, not quite offense, something closer to confusion. "You mean sparring? Light contact?" "I mean, I want to actually hit you. Not sparring, not playing. I want to show you the difference between what you think combat is and what it actually is." Bob Baker shifted uncomfortably by the wall. This wasn't what he described when he'd arranged the meeting. Dan Inosanto's face remained carefully neutral, but his eyes tracked every micro-movement. Every subtle shift in posture and energy. Joe Louis felt his jaw tighten. He'd come here as a courtesy, willing to exchange knowledge with someone whose reputation, however questionable, warranted investigation. But this was disrespect. This was some 135-pound instructor with no tournament record claiming he could just hit him. Joe Louis, who defeated the best traditional karate fighters in America. "You understand I'm the national champion." Joe kept his voice level, but there was steel underneath. "You understand I've been training since—" "I understand you've been training to win matches with rules," Bruce interrupted, still in that maddeningly calm tone. "I understand you're very good at tournament karate." "I'm not interested in tournament karate. I'm interested in what happens when someone is actually trying to damage you. When there's no referee to stop the fight if it gets too real. When the techniques you've drilled 10,000 times turn out to be designed for a version of combat that doesn't exist outside controlled environments." The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere outside, traffic hummed past on Western Avenue, completely unaware that inside this anonymous space, the future of American martial arts hung in the balance. Joe Louis had been challenged by drunk bar fighters who thought military training made them dangerous. He'd been challenged by practitioners of exotic styles who believed their secret techniques would overcome his systematic approach. He'd been challenged by bigger men, stronger men, men with more experience in styles he'd never heard of. He'd never been challenged quite like this. There was no heat in Bruce's voice, no ego, no posturing, just a quiet certainty that was somehow more unsettling than any amount of aggressive posturing would have been. "So what are you proposing?" Joe asked carefully. "I'm gonna hit you, really hit you, and you're gonna try to stop me. Use everything you know, everything you've learned, all those techniques that won you championships. And we're going to discover together whether they actually work when someone isn't playing by your rules." Joe Louis had two choices: walk out, which would confirm every suspicion that tournament fighters couldn't handle real confrontation, that their skills were purely theoretical, or accept, which meant potentially getting hurt by some instructor who probably had no idea what he was asking for. His pride made the choice for him. "All right." Joe adjusted his stance, settling into the ready position that had served him in dozens of matches. "Let's see what you've got." Bruce didn't move immediately. He studied Joe with the focused attention of a doctor examining symptoms, reading the alignment of his feet, the distribution of his weight, the tension in his shoulders, the chamber of his hands. He was looking at all the things Joe had been taught were correct, seeing them not as martial arts, but as vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. When Bruce spoke again, his voice had shifted into teaching mode, though the lesson was about to be delivered through demonstration rather than explanation. "Your stance is designed to generate power for the techniques you'll throw from chamber positions. It's optimized for the specific rule set you compete under. But watch what happens when." Bruce closed the distance between them in a fraction of a second, not with a leap or a charge, but with a footwork pattern Joe's brain couldn't quite process in real time. One instant, Bruce was outside striking range. The next instant, he was inside Joe's defensive perimeter, having covered the space with a shuffling movement that seemed to bypass the normal requirement for preparatory motion. Joe's hands came up automatically, the defensive patterns drilled into muscle memory activating without conscious thought. He started to chamber for the reverse punch that was his most reliable technique, the strike that had ended more matches than he could count. Bruce's lead hand, his right hand, which shouldn't have had enough distance to generate power from that position, struck Joe in the chest. Not a push, not a slap, an actual hit, delivered with shocking force considering the lack of visible windup. The impact landed just below Joe's sternum, driving the air from his lungs and sending a pressure wave through his torso that he felt in his spine. Joe stumbled backward 3 steps before his training reasserted control. His abs automatically contracted, protecting against follow-up shots. His hands came back up, but his mind was racing, trying to understand what had just happened. He'd seen the punch coming, or thought he had, but his defensive movement had somehow been mistimed. Arriving at a point in space Bruce had already vacated. Again, Bruce said, resetting to that same relaxed position. Joe felt heat rising in his face. That had been luck, a first-shot surprise. He wouldn't fall for whatever timing trick that had been. He adjusted his stance, weight distribution shifting to allow faster reactive movement. Bruce came in again, same shuffling approach, same compressed distance, same impossible speed. This time Joe was ready. He saw the lead hand coming, started his block earlier, committed to the defensive motion that would redirect the strike and create an opening for his counter. Bruce's hand never arrived where Joe's block was heading. It altered course mid-movement, flowing around the defensive motion like water around a stone. Arriving at Joe's ribs from an angle as chamber position. Couldn't protect. The second hit landed harder than the first. Joe felt it not just in the immediate impact zone, but radiating outward. The force transmitted through his body structure in a way that his conditioned abs and dense muscle couldn't fully absorb. He backed up, breathing hard now. Not from exertion. They'd barely been moving for 30 seconds, but from the cognitive dissonance of being hit cleanly, twice, by techniques that shouldn't have worked. His tournament experience said he was faster than this, more skilled than this, that his defensive structure should be preventing these hits from landing, but they were landing. And they were landing with the kind of force that would cause serious damage if Bruce wasn't clearly pulling impact at the last moment. Your defense is predictable, Bruce said, still in that teaching tone voice, not elevated despite the explosive movement he'd just demonstrated. You're defending against the techniques you expect, the attacks that come from specific ranges and angles. You've drilled those defenses thousands of times, so they're automatic. But automatic means predictable. Predictable means exploitable. Joe wanted to argue, wanted to explain that traditional technique worked because it was refined over centuries, tested by masters whose skill Joe would never claim to match. But his ribs were already aching, and his breath was coming short, and some part of his mind was beginning to suspect that everything he knew about fighting might be based on assumptions that didn't survive contact with someone who fought differently. One more time, Joe said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. I'll adapt. Bruce's expression remained neutral, but there might have been something like sadness in his eyes. Not mockery, not superiority. Sadness, as if he was disappointed that the lesson had to be taught this way. He came in again. This time Joe abandoned the traditional defensive structure entirely, opting for the kind of aggressive counterattack that had overwhelmed opponents who tried to pressure him. If Bruce wanted to get inside his range, Joe would make that space lethal, throwing combinations that filled the available area with strikes too numerous to slip. Bruce walked through Joe's combination like it was being thrown in slow motion. He didn't block the strikes so much as occupy spaces between them, his body angling and rotating in ways that made Joe's fists travel past their targets without connecting. And then, while Joe was committed to the third strike in his combination, unable to easily stop or redirect, Bruce hit him again. This time in the face, not full power, nowhere close to full power, but enough that Joe's vision whitened at the edges and his equilibrium stuttered. The strike landed on his left cheek, delivered with a snapping motion that seemed to multiply the force of Bruce's relatively small fist. Joe staggered, caught himself, reset his face stung, his chest and ribs ached, his breathing was ragged despite minimal exertion, and his mind was racing through every fight he'd ever had. Every technique he'd learned, trying to find something that would work against this. Bob Baker looked like he wanted to stop the session. Dan Inosanto watched with the calm attention of someone witnessing a necessary transformation, painful, but ultimately valuable. Bruce stepped back, giving Joe space. When he spoke, his voice had gentled slightly, the teacher recognizing the student was approaching the edge of what pride would allow. You're trying to use speed and power to overcome the problem I'm presenting. But speed and power only matter if your technique is efficient, if your motion is compact, if your defense doesn't require you to move twice as far as my attack moves. You're very fast, Joe, genuinely fast. But you're using that speed to perform traditional techniques that have built-in inefficiencies. Against other traditional stylists, those inefficiencies don't matter because they have the same limitations. Against someone who's eliminated those inefficiencies. He left the sentence unfinished. The conclusion was written in the ache spreading through Joe's torso, the ringing in his ears from that last facial strike. Joe Louis stood in the center of that anonymous training hall, national championship belt holder, Marine Corps veteran, practitioner of arts, whose lineage stretched back centuries, and felt the foundations of his understanding crack. Not break, not yet, but crack with the sound that precedes collapse. What he had to stop, swallow, force his throat to work properly. What am I doing wrong? It was perhaps the hardest question he'd ever asked. An admission of ignorance from someone whose identity was built on mastery, a surrender of the ego that had carried him through military service and tournament competition. Bruce's posture shifted, the predatory focus softening into something more open. He'd been testing, demonstrating, proving a point. Now he could teach. It's not that you're doing things wrong, Bruce said, approaching slowly, hands down in a gesture of non-threat. It's that you've been taught to do things in specific ways for specific contexts. Tournament point, sparring rewards, clean technique, visible power, control. So you've optimized for that context, but real fighting, fighting without rules, without referees, without stopping after clean contact, requires different optimization. He gestured at Joe's stance. Your front stance is stable, roots you to the ground, lets you generate power through hip rotation. But it also commits your weight in ways that slow your directional changes. It's a stance for someone who plans to stand and exchange techniques with an opponent who's also standing and exchanging. Bruce demonstrated his own stance, weight distributed differently, feet positioned for instant mobility. This stance sacrifices some power generation for mobility, but mobility is more valuable than power if your opponent can't hit you. And if you're hitting them repeatedly while they're trying to figure out where you went, the cumulative effect of multiple moderate power strikes exceeds the effect of one maximum power strike they saw coming. Joe listened, his mind simultaneously resisting and absorbing. Every point Bruce made contradicted something a master had taught him, some principle he'd internalized as fundamental truth. But the evidence was radiating through his nervous system, in the form of developing bruises and rattled equilibrium. Your hand positions are chambered at your ribs, ready to thrust forward with full extension. Classical karate, excellent for the context it was designed for. Probably armored opponents, or contexts where grabbing and controlling were primary concerns. But that chamber position means your hands have to travel further to reach me. And that travel time is an eternity when someone's already inside your defensive perimeter. Bruce showed his hand position, forward and active, protecting the center line while positioned to strike with minimal preparatory movement. This looks less formal, less classical. But it cuts my reaction time in half because my strikes start closer to you. Joe felt something shifting inside him, not just understanding but something deeper. The beginning of a fundamental restructuring of how he thought about combat. I've spent 6 years in tournaments, Joe said quietly. Won matches against the best traditional fighters in the country. Are you saying all of that was meaningless? Bruce shook his head. No, you developed incredible speed, timing, power, mental toughness. Those attributes are real, but you developed them in service of a specific rule set. I'm just showing you how to use those same attributes in a different context. The engine you built is powerful. I'm just suggesting you point it in a different direction. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Traffic continued outside, oblivious. And in that moment, Joe Louis made a choice that would change the trajectory of American martial arts. Teach me. 2 words. Simple, direct. The hardest words a master must ever say to a teacher. Bruce studied him for a long moment, looking past the bruised ego and wounded pride to see something more valuable underneath. Potential, the capacity for growth, the humility required for actual learning. Okay, Bruce said simply. What followed was 3 hours of systematic deconstruction and reconstruction. Bruce broke down every technique Joe had relied on, showed him why it worked in its original context and where it failed in. Others then demonstrated adaptations that preserved the core principle while eliminating the inefficiency. He showed Joe how to modify his stance for instant mobility without sacrificing stability, how to reposition his hands to reduce reaction time while maintaining defensive coverage, how to compress his striking motions, eliminating the preparatory movements that telegraphed intention, how to read an opponent's weight distribution to predict their available techniques, how to control distance not through backward movement but through subtle angling that created safety while maintaining offensive threat. Bob Baker and Dan Inosanto watched as Joe Louis, the national champion who'd entered expecting to exchange pleasantries with an interesting instructor, transformed into a student absorbing knowledge with desperate focus. His GI became soaked with sweat. His breathing became labored. His muscles screamed from unfamiliar movement patterns, and his mind raced to integrate concepts that contradicted years of previous training. Bruce never raised his voice, never mocked, never emphasized his superiority. He taught with the same quiet intensity he demonstrated with, recognizing that breaking someone's pride was easy but building them back up with genuine knowledge required something more difficult: patience. At some point, the sun outside transitioned from afternoon to evening. The harsh fluorescent lights became the primary illumination, painting everyone in that cold white glare. But inside that space, something warmer was forming. The respect between teacher and student, the recognition of shared obsession, with understanding combat at its deepest level. When they finally stopped, Joe's legs were shaking from exhaustion. His body carried the accumulated impact of hundreds of light contact strikes Bruce had landed throughout the session, each one a lesson about vulnerability, each one a corrective pointing toward better technique. Joe bowed, a genuine bow, not the formality of tournament protocol, but the deep respect of a student acknowledging a teacher's value. Bruce returned it with equal sincerity. "This stays between us," Bruce said quietly, looking at all four people present. "What happened here today?" Joe came to learn, not to be humiliated. His reputation stays intact. It was a gift. Recognition that destroying someone publicly proved nothing except cruelty. That real teaching happened in private, where ego could be confronted without shame, where transformation could occur without spectators. Joe nodded, still catching his breath. Agreed. Bob and Dan understood without needing explanation. What they'd witnessed was not entertainment for later storytelling. It was sacred in its own way. The necessary pain of growth, the transformation that required privacy to complete. They left separately, spaced out so no one would connect their departure to a significant event. The training hall returned to silence, holding the secret of what had occurred. 3 months later, Joe Louis entered his next tournament fighting completely differently. His stance had subtracted 6 inches of width and gained infinite mobility. His hands had abandoned the chamber positions for active forward guards. His strikes had compressed, become less visible in their preparation, more devastating in their arrival. His footwork had evolved from the linear advances and retreats of traditional karate into the angular, unpredictable patterns Bruce had drilled into him. He won the tournament by knockout in the first round, first minute, with strikes his opponent never saw coming from positions that appeared too close to generate power. The martial arts magazines that covered the event commented on his evolution and adaptation, attributing it to natural talent and training intensity. None of the writers knew about the afternoon, in a windowless training hall, the 4 minutes of demonstration that had broken his certainty, the 3 hours of reconstruction that had followed. 5 years later, Joe Louis was widely considered one of the most dangerous tournament fighters in America, known for an aggressive, unpredictable style that combined traditional karate with something observers couldn't quite categorize. When asked about his influences, he mentioned various teachers, various styles, never quite revealing the complete truth. Bruce Lee went on to revolutionize martial arts through film, books, and the formalization of Jeet Kune Do, his philosophy of combat optimization that rejected classical techniques in favor of practical efficiency. He trained champions, influenced generations, and changed how the world thought about fighting. He never spoke publicly about that afternoon session with Joe Louis, never used it as evidence of his superiority or validation of his approach. The silence was part of the teaching, the understanding that transformation happened privately, that real wisdom didn't require advertisement. 10 years later, in 1977, Bruce Lee had been dead for 4 years, his life ending at 32 from a cerebral edema that took him at the height of his influence. Joe Louis was at the peak of his tournament career, still competing, still winning, still carrying the lessons from that afternoon. In an interview for a martial arts magazine, a journalist asked Joe about his most influential training experience. Joe paused, weighing words carefully, aware that some truths existed beyond simple telling. I once trained with Bruce Lee, Joe said finally. One session changed everything. I thought I knew about fighting. I went in as a champion. Came out as a student. Best thing that ever happened to my martial arts. The journalist pressed for details. What techniques had been covered, what specific lessons had been taught, what had made it so transformative. Joe smiled and shook his head. Some things you have to experience personally, can't be explained properly. But I'll say this, Bruce had a gift for showing you the difference between what you think works and what actually works. And he did it with enough respect that you could hear the lesson instead of just feeling the humiliation. The journalist noted this for the article, having no idea he was documenting one of the only public acknowledgments of an event only 4 people had witnessed. The article ran with a brief mention of Joe's training with Bruce. One sentence among many, easy to overlook. 50 years later, the story exists primarily as rumor. Online forums argue about whether it happened at all. Some claim Bruce destroyed Joe completely, proving superior art. Others claim Joe held his own, showing traditional training's value. A few suggest it was friendly exchange between equals, nothing dramatic. The truth, as always, is more complex than any single narrative can capture. 4 people witnessed what happened in that training hall. All 4 are now dead, having taken the complete story with them. What remains is evidence in Joe Louis's fighting evolution, in his occasional cryptic comments about Bruce's influence, in the philosophy he developed that echoed Jeet Kune Do's emphasis on practical efficiency over classical tradition. The moment lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes of demonstration that broke one man's certainty and began his transformation. But those 4 minutes created ripples that spread across decades, influencing thousands of students who learned from Joe Louis, who learned from his students, who passed forward the integrated approach that traced back to that private session. So here's the question the story forces you to confront. Who in your life have you dismissed because they didn't fit your expectations of what mastery looks like? What have you refused to learn because it contradicted what you were originally taught? When was the last time you allowed yourself to be wrong, really wrong, fundamentally wrong, about something you built your identity around? Joe Louis entered that training hall as a champion defending his understanding of combat. He left as a student with a shattered certainty and the beginning of deeper wisdom. The transformation required being hit, being overcome, being proven wrong by someone he'd assumed he could handle. Most people never allow themselves that vulnerability, never submit to the teacher who threatens their ego, never accept the lesson that requires admitting everything they thought was true might be incomplete. Joe Louis did. And that choice, made in a moment of bruised pride and dawning humility, changed not just his fighting but the entire trajectory of American martial arts. His students became champions. Their students became innovators. The integration of Bruce's efficiency principles with traditional training spread through the tournament scene, through military combatives programs, through law enforcement training, evolving and adapting with each generation, all because one man had the strength to say, "Teach me," when his ego wanted to say, "This is bullshit." Real power isn't demonstrated by breaking someone and walking away satisfied. Real power is breaking someone carefully enough that they can be rebuilt stronger, teaching them the lesson so thoroughly they carry it forward, creating ripples that outlive the original moment. Bruce Lee understood this. Joe Louis learned it. The question is, do you 4 minutes, 4 people, one private lesson that was never meant to become public legend, and somewhere in the silence between what was witnessed and what can be proven, the truth continues to teach those willing to learn it. Strength isn't refusing to be vulnerable. Strength is choosing vulnerability with the right teacher at the right moment for the right reason. Joe Louis demonstrated more courage in saying "teach me" than in any tournament victory. He proved that wisdom comes not from defending what you know, but from admitting what you don't. In your life, right now, who's the teacher you've been refusing? What's the lesson you've been avoiding because it would require admitting you've been wrong? What ego are you protecting that's preventing you from growing into who you could become with that? 4 minutes changed everything for Joe Louis, not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to admit someone knew more. Strong enough to learn. Strong enough to transform. How many 4-minute lessons are you missing because you're too busy defending who you used to be to become who you need to be? The training hall is empty now. The witnesses are gone, but the lesson remains, waiting in the space between ego and humility, between defending your reputation and deserving it, between being proven wrong and choosing to grow. 4 people knew what happened. Now you know the truth behind the silence. What you do with it Whether you defend your current understanding or allow yourself to be transformed will determine whether. This story changes you the way that afternoon changed Joe Lewis. The choice, as always, is yours.